Guruve Gaura Chanjaya Radhikaya Tadali Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tad Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpa Turubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. My Dandavat Pranam devotees. So, Dandavat Sadhan Siddha Prabhu. Today there are two topics on the table. I'm not going to say short video. I'm praying it'll be timely because I do have some meetings today. But the subject matters are, many times we hear the statement that we need to be chaste, or we need to be very loyal, or we need to follow the teachings of Srila Prabhupada. So, and then the second separate question, but perhaps related, is what is actually innovation in preaching? So, with the first subject matter, what does it actually mean to follow, be loyal to, or chaste to the teachings of Srila Prabhupada? In my travels and in my experiences with many devotees over the course of years, the statement being loyal to or chaste to or strictly following the teachings of Srila Prabhupada has often been conflated with being chaste to, loyal to, following the teachings that I've understood from Srila Prabhupada. In other words, if we don't make that distinction, it generally starts to assume that whatever we've gleaned from our study of Srila Prabhupada's writings, because in many cases I even hear from devotees who've never met Srila Prabhupada, who've never attended a class of Srila Prabhupada's. But still they're speaking in terms of loyalty, chastity to the teachings of Srila Prabhupada. And also, many have not had opportunity. I don't want to say it's a lack of inspiration or lack of zeal to read all of Srila Prabhupada's books, but many devotees have not. They've not completely read Bhagavad Gita, at least the main corpus, Bhagavad Gita, Chaitanya Charitamrita, and certainly Srimad Bhagavatam. So they have not done full study, what to speak of study, even full reading, cursory reading of all three of those, what to then speak of all the summaries like Nectar of Devotion, Nectar of Instruction, Krishna book, so forth, so on. So, obviously then to be able to make a statement to others regarding loyalty, chastity, etc. to the teachings of Srila Prabhupada could become a little bit of a misplaced statement if it's not accurately aligned with the idea that Srila Prabhupada's teachings overall, and the teachings obviously of the previous acharyas, because Srila Prabhupada did not, as he mentioned himself many times, did not come to give something different, but he came to give the authenticity of what it is that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and our Guru Parampara has given, to the point of entitling Bhagavad Gita as it is, which is to make that distinction that this was not an innovative or a speculative or a recreated version of Bhagavad Gita, but it was the genuine teaching given by Sri Krishna to Arjuna in those 700 verses, and that they were explained according to the Vichardhara, or to the line of conception coming from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and relying on the commentary which our Srila Prabhupada did of Srila Baladev Vijayabhushan Prabhu. So, when we say, again, loyalty, chastity, following strictly the teachings of Srila Prabhupada, we have to always assess whether we're meaning follow what we understood, or we mean following the teachings. Because it would be very difficult. Srila Prabhupada had thousands and thousands of disciples, what to speak of followers, what to speak of a whole second generation of devotees going into a third generation, perhaps, of devotees. And what those thousands and thousands of disciples and followers have gleaned from the teaching will be individual. Now, there may be some consensus in terms of, there's a whole group that has understood a particular Siddhanta in a certain way, right? But it's not that there's going to be a homogeneous understanding, because everybody's unfoldment in bhakti may be at a different level. The different iterations that we go through in bhakti are largely dependent on previous life samskars. It's largely dependent on how much application to the process we've done in this life. This is called Praktanaka Aduni Chasti Yatsad Bhakti Vasana. So it says, according to previous life's impressions, and also currently what you're doing has given a sort of basis of where you are in your unfoldment in bhakti, right? And then obviously there's the progressive stages of bhakti, from Shraddha to Sadhu Sangha, Bhajana Kriya, Anartha Nivritti, Nishta Ruchi, Ashakti Bhav, etc. So we have to see also where a person is in that crumb, in that progression of bhakti, because their insights into the teachings will be illuminated more or less depending on the nature of their advancement in bhakti. So if you find someone who perhaps is a younger devotee actually, and they may make a suggestion that a certain statement or a certain line of thought is not in line with the teachings of Srila Prabhupada, it may be as much due to their being unfamiliar even with Srila Prabhupada's own books, but certainly unfamiliar with a certain depth of understanding of something in Srila Prabhupada's books. As far as the study of literatures outside of the direct writings of Srila Prabhupada, that's very difficult to say happens. Because if you read Srila Prabhupada's books closely, and I've quoted on several occasions Adi Lila, chapter 2, verse 117, in which Srila Prabhupada lays out in what would be the right word? Very bold terms, the importance of studying the books of the previous acharyas. And he mentions by name the Sandarbhas of Jiva Goswami Pad. In the very first verse of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, he refers to the Sa'artha Darshini commentary of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur for understanding. He certainly has quoted Jaiva Dharma, Ujjwalini Mani, if you read Chaitanya Charitamrita. So Srila Prabhupada has openly described the writings of the previous acharyas, and I'll need to, especially if you read Adi Lila 2:117, forcefully he spoke that for lack of zeal to study these books, one does not obtain pure devotion. You couldn't make a more bold statement regarding the importance of the study of the books of the previous acharyas. So one may ask, well, if Srila Prabhupada thought them to be so important, why did he not write them? If you look in Srila Prabhupada's books very closely, he has done synopsis work on all the books he's quoted. Also, we have to look at the Acharya Leela of Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada wanted to establish a foundation. And though he put even the most advanced things within his writings, he wanted to make sure that to properly progress to understanding those things, that the foundation was very solid. So Srila Prabhupada did much work in doing that foundational establishment. And though he has, if you read Adi Lila chapter 4, Ramananda Samvad, Rupa Siksha, Sanatan Siksha, and Chaitanya Charitamrita, you'll find many of the conceptions that are written in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and even Srila Prabhupada has a summary in the form of Nectar Devotion of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So it's not that these things are not there, but Srila Prabhupada makes reference to the original works because obviously there was the time in their writing at that time to flush out all the details of those conceptions in those writings. So Srila Prabhupada didn't need to reinvent the wheel, but he could give us reference to those for further research, and he's established essential conclusions around those things in his writings. So the idea of not studying the books of the previous Acharya has been soundly defeated by Srila Prabhupada. And I did another video on that, so I'm not going to reiterate it or go into much detail about it here. The other thing is that sometimes we have a very narrow vision of a particular line of thought. that appears in Srila Prabhupada's books, even to the point now where there are some devotees who have become critical of certain phrasing or certain social statements that Srila Prabhupada has made, and they're having difficulty, they feel, to defend it in their preaching fields. So there's suggestions that something should be done. And in fact, some people have outright, due to perhaps not having deep bhakti samskars, and more so not being able to understand Srila Prabhupada, obviously because they may not have been around during his physical presence, or they have not had a deep enough epiphany regarding the actual nature of Srila Prabhupada and his Acharya Leela, and even more simple than that, they may not have done an assessment of those statements as much as they were triggered just by the statements themselves regarding race or gender or social issues and so forth and so on. Of course, we all see things. Srila Prabhupada mentioned that there are 9 processes of bhakti yoga. But he said that until a person has some maturation in bhakti, their practice remains under the modes of material nature. So he gave that example, I believe maybe in the 2nd canto, 3rd canto as well, or one of the 2, where he mentions that the 3 modes of material nature, they're always in flux. So goodness, passion, and ignorance are never one-dimensional. They always work as a sort of blending constantly. So he said when you count the mutations of the modes of nature, so 3 times 3 would be 9, and you take the 9 processes of devotional service, 9 times 9 is 81. So he assessed that devotees can be practicing in 81 different varieties of the modes of nature. Prominent for devotees who've taken to the lifestyle of bhakti is the mode of material goodness. What is this verse? Tatra Sudha Nirmalatvat Prakashakam Anamayam Sukha Sangena Bhadnati Jnana Sangena Cha Anangaha. So, in the 14th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna assesses that because the mode of material goodness, Sattvam Nimalatvat, is superior to passion and ignorance, it gives a sense of illumination. But then he gives a description of what happens. Prakashakam Anamayam. The sensibility that's developed by being in the mode of goodness is that I am okay. I've also done a video on this. Again, I'm not going to go into detail here because I don't want to make these videos sort of redundant, right? So he says, Prakashakam Anamayam. I am good. I'm happy with my life. Everything is feeling good because that's the nature of the mode of goodness. Sukha Sangena Bhadnati. So this word Bhadnati means it binds one. So it binds one to a false conception of happiness, because the happiness is not transcendental or divya sukh. It's not transcendental happiness. It's happiness derived from the influence of sattva gun, the mode of material goodness, and jnana sangena cha, and also one associates with sensibilities and knowledge related to that mode of goodness. So for this reason, if they will read something which triggers their sensibilities in the mode of goodness, it may be difficult for them to digest. To the point where I've mentioned many devotees have even left the association of devotees, left the process of hearing and chanting, etc., based solely on being triggered by those social statements of Srila Prabhupada and some purports, etc., etc. So, among the whole idea of following Srila Prabhupada's teachings, this is one other element that has to be dealt with, that even when we look at Srila Prabhupada's teachings, we also have to look at Srila Prabhupada's teachings through the prism of the person himself. So and I did a video about this a very long time ago, and sometimes these kind of conversations are very necessary, pragmatic, practical conversations about the practice of bhakti. Because though there is such a wonderful theological foundation in bhakti, such there's a wonderful illuminating reality to what it is that's part of the system of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, still the practical personal adjustments to the practice also have to be sometimes dealt with. So my point here was that we have to know anytime we want to assess statements, especially if they're written statements, we need to know the person and have some idea of motivation and intent in their general speaking to understand, especially a written statement, because you don't have the benefit to get the clarification, like in the case of some of the statements of Srila Prabhupada regarding race or gender or other social issues. We don't have the benefit at this point to go back and ask Srila Prabhupada about the intentionality of what he was speaking on at that particular time. But if we look at the overall person, what was Srila Prabhupada's persona? What was his mood? What was his inner motivation around coming to America in the first place, around bringing the teachings of Gaudiya Vaishnavism to the West? What was the essential core motivations of all of that? It certainly wasn't to establish, social issues, gender issues, racial issues, right? And nor can we say that we have a history of Srila Prabhupada in his dealings with devotees, or even our prior knowledge of his history prior to coming to America, some sensibilities around racism or misogyny or anything else, right? Now, what we can assess from the body of Srila Prabhupada's writings is that Srila Prabhupada, Haribol Tirtha Prabhu, again, I'm always offering my thanks to you. So without interrupting the flow of conversation here, I just wanted to acknowledge you because I'm always very appreciative of everything that you do to help me in many regards. So if we look at the body of Srila Prabhupada's writings, we'll see clearly that Srila Prabhupada's posture was always making an analysis of faults and virtues of material life and their relevance or their position in relation to spiritual reality. So Srila Prabhupada never had any kind of material motivations regarding anything that he may have spoken about in purports, but they were always a critique, if you will, of faults and virtues of the social dynamics, whatever they might be, race, gender, other social issues, and then putting them in relation to the absolute reality, which is obviously love of God and the soul's nature as being the servant of God, etc. So his posture was always coming from that perspective and was never motivated by anything else except to give the absolute gift of love of God and realization of who we are was the foundational motivation and intention of what he did. Now, if you grasp that and then you read anything, you would bring that context into what it is you read. And therefore you would obviously see that there was no racial motivation, there was no gender motivation, there was no misogyny, etc., etc. Now, originally this issue rose out of an idea that, well, it's not just our personal reading, but it's what we have to do when we distribute the books, sell the books, give the books to others, and they may see these things. Well, part of the expertise of preaching, Sastra Yukti Suni Punya. Suni Punya, Rupa Goswami describes as an expertise in not only understanding the Sastra, but Yukti means not only Sastric logic, which means the unfolding of the meaning of Sastra, but Yukti here also means the application of Sastra. So a preacher has to be very expert in application of Gaudiya philosophy. It can't simply be that you understand the philosophy very well, and even to the point where sometimes in the olden days, and even currently, preachers weaponize the philosophy, and everybody they encounter, they whip the philosophy out as almost like a tool of submission. No matter what your spiritual status is at that time, if it doesn't come to the position of absolute pure bhakti, etc., which they may not have even realized, right? They will whip you with the philosophy of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. You understand? I'm saying this because I've had many preaching programs where there are people who are all brand new to the process. Doesn't mean they're brand new to bhakti as a whole, because again, I mentioned people may have previous bhakti impressions or samskars. You understand? But in the general spectrum of their experience with bhakti in this life, they are relatively new. So in many of those cases, you have to be able to speak the philosophical tenets of bhakti in a way that they will digest them, that they'll be able to digest them and it will be meaningful for them. And sometimes that entails the ability to listen, to hear where they are, to hear their perspective, to hear what it is they're experiencing in their spirituality or lack thereof, if that's the case, and to be able to inspire and motivate as much by friendship and hearing from them as giving philosophical information. Sometimes information about what it is they do for a living, how are they in terms of their appreciation of art or music. Sometimes that may entail how they live their life. You understand? So there's so many dynamics that go into creating a personal relationship. We're speaking of philosophy that is absolutely about personalism. So it is very impersonal to cut off a person's personality to impose our personal realizations and understandings in a particular environment. Right? There are different kinds of preaching. If I go to university, I'm giving a lecture at a university, or I'm giving a lecture to just a bunch of people who are perhaps practitioners of a particular spiritual system. Then I'll have to make the preaching, I'll have to make the interaction according to that environment. If I'm speaking to people who are all brand new, maybe don't have very much familiarity with Krishna consciousness, and I'm present there with tilak and devotee dress, etc., etc., then I have to first establish a relationship, because they have to see person to person, not a person who's looking at a whole cultural imposition. You understand? One of the things I could say was very helpful when I went to open temples in Africa was probably by some karmic arrangement. I had so much experience in African culture, religion, music, etc. prior to going to Africa. Right? That wasn't a calculated thing. That just happened to be in my history as a musician and a drummer and so forth, that I got into the culture of the drum, and that happened to relate to the fact there are many things in the African cosmology that are related to drumming and so forth and so on. So what I'm bringing out here is sometimes there's a necessity to get a personal relationship with someone based on other things. And once that personal relationship is there, the portal of the heart can open more. If somebody comes to hear a lecture, they normally hear a lecture with great filters, right? They're going to hear everything if they are truly paying attention, because at a certain point, I've seen where a devotee may be lecturing, and they may be lecturing at such a level that it's going in one ear and out the other for people who just simply are not at that level. You understand? Now, sometimes those are difficult circumstances, because if you're in a mixed audience of very mature devotees and people who are brand new, then I've always actually separated the kata. I'll actually mention, I would now like to speak some things for those who are more steeped in our tradition and practice. Right? Before I just launch into a whole deep dive into Ujjalini Money or, the Sandarbhas or Bhagavatam verses, etc. Right? I give some preference to those who are people coming new so that they can feel inclusive even when it gets to a point where they no longer can catch what's being said or what's going on. They've already felt a sense of inclusion, and therefore they can feel, oh, I was included, and here is a direction that I'll have to go in a deeper way to understand. So I'm pointing out all these things, maybe to make a long story short, that we have to be able to have Sastra Yukti, the application of Sastra according to the audience. And I'm going to segue here as to not make this very long, because I think I have covered the idea of what it means to be chaste, loyal, and to follow the teachings of Srila Prabhupada. I hope I adequately got that point across. So now I want to segue into the idea of preaching and what is innovation in preaching. And I did not want to entitle this what the question that was written to me, because the question was written about a particular emphasis from a particular person who's preaching and has developed a whole model of preaching, and they have a name for it and everything else. But I've spoken about it a long time ago, and so I don't want to create a sense of dichotomy with that particular style of preaching and so forth and so on. And so in order to avoid that, I'm just simply speaking about innovation in preaching in general. If you look at the history of the line coming from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, if you even look into Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's own personal Leela, you will always see that there was innovation in preaching, right? Because preaching essentially is the time, place, and circumstance application of delivering an eternal message. Just like the Puranas. The word Purana means Pura Apinavam. That which is ancient but has relevance today. Pura Apinavam. This is the meaning of the word Purana. Right? So, in the same way, we are taking very ancient teachings. Srimad Bhagavatam is an eternal teaching. It's not a dated teaching. I remember having a whole debate with somebody who tried to give me the academic dating of Srimad Bhagavatam, and I properly wrote him and told him, in academia, if that's what you need to do to satisfy your academic requirements, is one thing. But the actuality of Srimad Bhagavatam is that it's an eternal reality. And it simply manifests, becomes unmanifest in different situations within the material universes, but Srimad Bhagavatam is an eternal reality. Right? But still, we, in our preaching, right, we have to make Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, whatever shastras we're talking about, have relevancy to that particular person at this particular time. Now, does that mean that the innovation has to take on physical attributes? It may or may not. Does it have to take on particular cultural changes? It may or may not. So first we have to examine what is actually preaching. Srila Prabhupada in his own books, there's some verses he quotes many, many, many times over. One is, Krishna Shakti Vina Nahe Tava Pavartan. That unless one is particularly empowered by the Lord, he cannot preach. So in other words, Srila Prabhupada is making the connection that preaching is a matter of the empowerment of Krishna and hence Guru Parampara. So the essence of successful preaching is not a marketing strategy. It's not about the innovation, but it is about the alignment with the Shakti or power or empowerment coming in Parampara from Krishna himself. Krishna is the Antaryami or super soul in the heart of every individual and in the heart of that person who's serving the Vichardhara, or the line of conception coming from Krishna Guru Parampara. It's the opening of those heart portals that create successful preaching. It's not a matter of numbers. At one point, I think it was 1972 or 73, I don't remember the date. I've heard this statement many times, though I did have the opportunity to start going to the temple in 1972 and had Darshan Srila Prabhupada, I think in that same year, and then again in 1976. But anyway, he mentioned at that time that we have enough members. I don't know how many people had joined the movement, how many disciples there were, but he said now it is time to boil the milk, which means it's now time to take those who have come and really develop their maturation in bhakti. But of course, the flow, by the service devotees were rendering to Srila Prabhupada, the continuum of a flow of aspiring disciples and followers and congregational members continued to grow. But Srila Prabhupada did express he wanted that time, that situation in which the growth of the core could take place. In other words, the maturation of devotees in the actual understanding of what it is that Srila Prabhupada came to give, that would take place. That was very, very important to Srila Prabhupada. So when we start talking about what is preaching, it is essentially the empowerment to enter into the heart of someone and communicate in such a way that it awakens their previous bhakti samskars or creates new samskars in that person going forward, because their bhakti may pick up even in another life. So that's really the success of preaching. It's not by numbers, it's not by buildings, it's not by a financial portfolio, it's not by membership applications and waiting, it's not by any of the external metrics. It's really about how many hearts were genuinely affected. When Srila Prabhupada was asked, I believe this was in Atlanta, what would please him most, and of course I've heard this story many times and how it was couched in such a way as to maybe solicit an answer that would suggest book distribution, because all the book distributors were there, that book distribution is what pleased Srila Prabhupada most. But Srila Prabhupada said what would please him most is to see someone become pure devotee. That pure devotion being established was really what would make him the most happy. To distribute millions of books in thousands of languages, the efficacy of that would be that somehow or another, someone getting one of those books, getting sadhu sangha, would become a pure devotee. That's the actual metric of success. You understand? that if someone will become a pure devotee. So, in regards to, especially relating to the devotees' questions, and again, you can understand, I'm not going down the track of that particular organizational format for preaching. I'm just describing in general, which may be cross-board about preaching and innovation, right? That really preaching and its success, as I've already mentioned, is based on Krishna Shakti Vinanahe Tava Pavartan. Being without having that Shakti means with that Shakti, and being successful in preaching are synonymous. Successful preaching is the deliverance of Krishna Shakti. You understand? So here, the point will be that if innovation is a means, right? If it's a means in any particular circumstance to allow that Shakti to flow, that's fine. But there is no wholesale marketing strategy for how that should happen. Whether devotees remain in dhoti and kurta and they sing bhajans in Hindi or Bengali or Sanskrit language, or whether their, presentation in the temple is full of not Indian culture, but this was a culture of Vaishnavism. Actually, if you study the history, this was not just a matter of Indian culture. This was a matter of the culture of Vaishnavism. That Vaishnavism came from India. You understand? The cultural context may be shaped a lot around things which have influence, right? But there is an essential Vaishnav culture. You will not find all over India everybody does every exact thing the same way. So you can't say as a wholesale what Srila Prabhupada brought in terms of dress, music, culture, etc. is just Indian culture. First of all, it kind of offends the idea that Vaishnavism as a whole and the different things, including Vaishnav Chinadaran, Tila, Kantimala, etc., Shika, that all these things are Indian culture. You understand? They're not. So they're Vaishnav culture. You understand? And just as in any clergy, in any system of spirituality, you'll find a clergy there, whether it's the imam at the mosque, whether it is the priest at the Catholic Church, or whether it is the rabbi at the synagogue. They all have their particular cultural dress, etc., etc. So, Srila Prabhupada actually successfully established Krishna consciousness on the basis of that Vaishnav culture. So obviously there's not a problem with cultural presentation. You understand? And for those who have such a hard time getting past the cultural presentation, then we cannot say, which I've also heard this argument being given, that we cannot depend on the idea of Sukriti. But that idea of Sukriti is not something that's created by some institutional idea of preaching. Sukriti is written in Sastra. Right? Bhaktishu Bhagavat Bhakta Sangena Parijayate Satsanga Prapyate Pumbir Sukriti Purva Sanjate. When there's enough Akrayat Sukritis, Bhakti Unmukhi Sukritis, then a person gets Bhagavat Sangha, the Sangha of a devotee. And they can understand. Bhaktistu means this process of bhakti can then be understood. So Sukriti is not somebody's idea, it's actually a sastric reality. That the Sukriti file means the fruit of Sukriti, especially Bhakti Unmukhi Sukriti, in a particular individual creates a more or less vibrancy around their ability to resonate with the process of Bhakti Yoga. So that's not some artificial imposition that can remove simply by intellectually appealing to people void of any cultural barriers, so to speak, if you want to couch it like that. So we cannot say that simply because then also what will you do? If you say, okay, well, everything is Indian culture, may be a hindrance to the progress of the mass preaching of Krishna consciousness, well, two things would have to be shown. One is, you'd have to show a mass success in the preaching modality that you've taken up, right? So before you'd even have to match the metric of what's currently going on in Srila Prabhupada's institution with the preaching that's going on. You'd have to first match that before you can, or exceed it, before you can criticize it as being ineffective, outdated, or no longer having potency to go forward in Krishna consciousness. The second thing is, when you make a presentation, and even if you entitle it with a particular terminology, and you're saying, I'm just going to make this my market share. In other words, if that's fine, if I'm going to have a targeted audience to preach to. Obviously, when I went to Africa to preach, as I just mentioned earlier, having some background in culture, theology, music, and everything of Africa was very helpful because it is a targeted audience of people to preach to. Everybody is the soul, but their particular karmic iteration speaks to a certain resonance with cultural patterns, etc., etc. So no harm if you're going to address that audience for that. But that's not a absolute thing, that now the entire preaching prospect for Srila Prabhupada's mission as a whole is this. You understand? You understand? So there are many devotees who, in the thrust of their own practice, realizations, etc., etc., find great success in preaching and bringing people to Krishna consciousness in the exact same model they received from Srila Prabhupada, right? During his Acharya Leela, right? So we can find and critique so many things to look at how to improve them, but it's very difficult to make blanket assessments of things and therefore feel, as a result of that, that there is some lacking, some misunderstanding, again, of Srila Prabhupada. Back to my original question, right, about the following of chastity of Srila Prabhupada, because unfortunately I have heard sometimes criticism based around the fact that everybody doesn't automatically align with the perception that the person who's championing that particular avenue of preaching, that everybody doesn't fall in line, is indicative they somehow have not understood even Srila Prabhupada, right? So we have to be very careful on that, because, you know, that's a personal opinion, quite frankly, and it's an opinion that may not, it could lead to aparad. So that's the danger in that particular personal opinion. Now, to say I have an inspiration to preach in a certain way, and I'm going to go out in my service to Srila Prabhupada, and I'm going to execute this. If I find great success with it, you understand? And if I even try, if I'm trying, and it's not as successful, to try is bhakti, because it's a mood of service. Bhakti is serving. Bhaj datu iti sevayam. The very root of the word bhakti is service, motivated by love. So by love of Srila Prabhupada, if you're taking a particular angle of service, if it is super successful, it is moderately successful, if you are inspired and one or two people come, then that is service to Srila Prabhupada. You understand? So innovation in preaching has always been there. If you look in history of Mahaprabhu all the way down to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur and things that he did, throughout Srila Prabhupada, adjustments that he made, so forth, there's never entailed philosophical changes. You understand? Right? But there are adjustments to environments for preaching. But Srila Prabhupada's inner thrust of what preaching was based on the verse that I quoted, Krishna Shakti Vinanayita Avapavartam. Krishna Shakti. So this idea of purity is the force was a popular saying. I'm not sure if that was a statement from Srila Prabhupada. I've never really seen it. Now, I certainly would not doubt it. You understand? That purity is the force, and I think they also had books of the bases, and something else went along with that. But certainly, according to even Sastra, purity is the force of what creates the ability to bring people to Krishna consciousness. And bringing people to Krishna consciousness is not a sprint, it's a marathon. Because there's somebody whose sukritis are not very developed, so in this life, for them, hearing Harinam begins their bhakti unmukhi sukritis. Receiving a book begins their bhakti unmukhi sukritis. Taking prasad, seeing a Vaishnav, seeing the tilak on the forehead of a Vaishnav. Right? So there's just so many different things. We don't want to categorize things or try to box things or to put forward our vision, right, as the absolute perspective on Srila Prabhupada or the absolute perspective on preaching and innovation, right? Simply go and in a heartfelt way offer that as a service to Srila Prabhupada, Guru Parampara, and allow your own bhakti to grow from that, because our whole mood is we're serving for our own unfoldment and growth. You understand? We're serving for that. So we will become what Prabhupada desired most, which was pure Vaishnava. You understand? So this is the real modality of doing the seva. It's not outcome based. You'll not accumulate a so-called spiritual bank account that then will allow you a special, you get on the, when you used to go to different venues, they'd have the club for a certain level of people, the line for a certain level of people and a line for other people, right? So, fortunately, the path to Goloka Vrindavan is not geared like that. So you won't get there and say, oh, well, I see you collected so much money, you did so many things, you get in this line. You understand? It will strictly be based on the nature of your devotion. All right, so I'm going to end here. I just want to get those. These are simple points. This was not meant to be a deeply philosophical presentation or anything. It was just to address a couple of points. One was, both were gleaned from questions that I had. And I still have a backlog of questions. That's probably going to be a perpetual thing, which is good because it always gives me some service to do. And again, I always do these things for my own edification as well. So I'm not trying to necessarily preach to people. I'm trying to share understanding and share, and I always try to back that by Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra. Again, that's for my own foundational steadiness, right? I don't want to just give my opinion, my idea, etc., etc. So two things. One was a look at what it really means to be chaste, loyal, and to follow the teachings of Srila Prabhupada. Second thing was, what is truly innovation in preaching? And what is the basis of preaching in general? If we get that foundational understanding, preaching is, in fact, the empowerment of Krishna to give bhakti from one heart to another heart. That's the real nature of preaching. Right? Alright, my Dandavat Pranam devotees, Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha, Kripa Shindavevacha, Patitanam Pavanevyo, Vaishnavebhyo, Namo Namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.